Good morning. Welcome to Hell, also called Istanbul, where we had another earthquake yesterday. It was a small tremor, roughly 5 at Richter scale, but in a few years we will have another one at Richter scale of 8 or above, and this city will be part of the Marmara Sea. Yesterday, Turkey Statistics Agency Turkstat announced November inflation figures, CPI at 62%. That's the official count. According to private sector measurements, it's somewhere north of 100%, and PPI at 42%. These are outrageous figures, and the new economic team of the government is tightening monetary policy as we speak, videos below, to fight the inflation problem. But inflation cannot be singly fought with monetary policy. Today, I want to talk about fiscal policy, or Turkey's long-term nightmare, which is the chronic budget deficits. Now remember, fight inflation and current account, Turkey's two major problems. You need coordinated economic policy. You need to start with cyclical policies, such as tight monetary policy, cutting budget deficits or raising taxes, and then move on to structural reforms, which are sort of like improving the condition of the economy to make sure we don't fall into these bad situations once again. I've already commented enough on monetary policy. It will continue to be tightened. In fact, I said monetary policy will be tightened so much that we will not have a Turkish lira or currency crisis in the winter. The budget problem is much more thornier. If you live in the United States, you would understand that budget deficits are not cyclical. They are not caused by elections or by a downturn in the economy or one-off factors. They are structural. In the United States, the problem is a dysfunctional Congress and presidency which cannot agree on reforms, and of course the aging population. In Turkey, we have several problems, and this is the topic of today's video, our nightmare. Turkey may experience and will probably experience a better year in terms of economics in 2024, but in a few years the piper will have to be paid, and the name of that piper is the budget. Let me put things in perspective by giving you some numbers. This year's budget deficits will be around 5% of Turkish GDP, which is on the highish end of what's considered acceptable. In fact, in Turkey, the situation is probably better because Turkey had suffered an earthquake which caused roughly $100 billion of material damage. Obviously, most of this will be compensated by government spending, and this spending probably adds 1 to 1.5% to annual budget deficits. So the trend deficit is 3.5% of GDP, which is acceptable. Turkey has another advantage. The average public debt to GDP ratio in emerging markets is something like 65%, give or take a couple of percentage points. In Turkey, this is 40. Those of you who follow Turkish economy may claim, well, this is an understatement because Turkey has a lot of conditional liabilities which are not included in the budget deficit. But even if you throw those in, Turkey's public debt to GDP ratio is something like 50%, which is very low, which means that Turkey can actually afford to spend more. And in fact, it will. Budget expenditures will increase by 150% next year, almost 3 times the rate of expected inflation. Why is it so difficult to cut budget deficits? One may argue the political will is not there because, tightening monetary policy is bad for some people, but most of the population don't care much unless they lose their job. But almost all of us either pay taxes or derive some kind of income from the state. Therefore, any budget decision is going to be extremely controversial and is going to hurt one group of people compared to the other. But that's only a small problem. Turkey's big budget nightmare is that 90% of the budget is committed. It is either legislatively guaranteed or for any practical purposes, it's almost impossible to cut. And this is where the situation becomes a nightmare. Let's look at the black holes or structural rigidities in the Turkish budget. A, interest expenditures or financial expenditures. These are again low, roughly 3-4% of GDP, but they are only low because under the previous economic team, bond yields were roughly 1/6 of the rate of inflation. Now, the new economic team is liberalizing the Turkish bond market where the government does most of its borrowing, which means bond yield or the government financial expenditures will increase exponentially in the coming years. They could soon exceed 5% of GDP and essentially becomes uncontrollable simply because if you don't cut the budget deficit or if you can't raise taxes, you'll need to borrow more, and every year borrowing becomes more expensive and cuts into spending on other items which are necessary for rapid development such as, human skill building, education, health, infrastructure, etc. 2, personnel expenditures. Today, Mesele Economy is again helping me with this broadcast. I want to express my gratitude to them. In last week's chat, my fellow presenter said that Turkey employs 5.2 million people in civil service, plus the army, which means roughly 6 million people are employed by the state, which is roughly 1/5 of the total people employed. Let me repeat this. 1 out of every 5 persons in Turkey is employed by the state. This is really as bad as communist China, and certainly as bad as communist Russia in Soviet era. And, even though Turkish laws are not as rigid as American laws, it's almost impossible to fire these people. And I'm not saying they should be fired. But you see, you have personal expenditures that are carved in stone. You cannot reduce them. And with high inflation, you have to raise their wages and salaries all the time. Reason 3, Social Security contributions. Social Security contributions are a nightmare for Turkish economy, simply because by the end of this year, or next by the latest, we will have 15 million retirees in a country with an insured workforce of at most 30 million, which means 2 active workers are supporting 1 pensioner. The minimum acceptable ratio is 3-to-1. 4 would be better. In countries like Turkey, where the population is relatively young, almost 30 years, so not necessarily teenage young, but still demographically expansion state, the workforce is in the expansion state, you would expect that ratio to be at least 4-to-1. Since the Social Security Administration cannot raise payroll taxes or even collect those taxes outstanding, the state will have to finance those expenditures. And this problem will get worse as time advances, not necessarily because the Turkish population is getting older. It is getting older. But the big problem is Turkish universities throw out roughly 1 million graduates every year, and most of them can't get jobs. Turkey's youth unemployment ratio is 20% or slightly higher. And if you don't have younger people finding jobs, then they're not going to pay Social Security contributions. In fact, they are going to become a burden on the state, because even if they are young, you have to somehow make sure that they don't starve to death and, start a revolt. A problem related to that is that, according to official figures, which in Turkey and China ought to be taken with a grain of salt, 40% of population draws an income that's very close to the minimum statutory wage, which is also below the poverty line, which is also way below the hunger line. If people can barely bring food to their table, they're not going to contribute much to the Social Security. You see the problem here? These are really intractable, and they would take massive and very painful reforms, which would probably end or spell the end of the then current government when they are enacted. And the final one is very Turkey specific. They're called Build, Operate, Turnover projects, or with the new term, the PPP projects, public-private sector projects, participation project, which means instead of spending money on infrastructure, the state authorizes a company or a consortium of companies to build a bridge, to build a tollway, to build a tunnel, to build an airport, to build an hospital, and they share the revenues. In Turkey, this is obviously the recommended model by the World Bank. If deployed properly, it does wonders for the budget, because you are pushing a lot of spending off the budget to the private sector, and then you share the risks and revenues. In Turkey, these concessions are structured in a way that the state always loses. This is how it works. The concession holders for toll bridges, for instance, or toll roads, are legally allowed to raise their tolls, not only in line with inflation, but also in line with the appreciation of dollar against the Turkish lira, simply because they have dollar loans. So they win. 2, if they can't generate enough traffic to make them profitable, the state promises to pay the difference from the budget. But if they make extraordinary profit, they don't pay more to the state. Do you understand the asymmetrical nature of this contract? It's like a lose-lose strategy for the state. And these are barely 1% of the GDP. But consider the following years when the structure can't be changed. I mean, your average concession is 15 years. Sometimes it's up to 30 years, which means you are stuck with this contract for 30 years. And because toll fees rise by as much as inflation or the dollar per year, people cannot afford to use these roads. One good example is the new Istanbul Bridge over Bosphorus, or the Çanakkale Bridge, which spans of the Dardanelles or Dardanelles Strait. I invite you to drive the car through them. They are empty, simply because they are so expensive no one can afford them. People prefer to lose 2-3 hours using alternative routes to get to their destination instead of paying the excruciatingly high toll fees. So, do you understand the problem? It's sort of like cancer. In the first stages, you don't feel it unless you go checkups every month. It builds slowly, and at some point you start feeling the pain. That's where Turkish budget is. We have these black holes. We have rising interest rate expenditures. We have personnel spending, which is cast in stone. We have Social Security contributions, which will almost definitely and certainly will increase over the years. And we have the strange arrangements with the private sector, where they siphon off from the budget, not necessarily because they provide a valuable service, but because we have, they're part of the crony regime. And in a few years, no matter how hard the current economy team works to bring inflation down, it will have to rise again. simply because if the government can't pay off its debts or raise new money to finance its expenditures, it always resort to inflation. Thank you very much for watching Real Turkey channel. This is Atilla Yeşilada. One more time, my gratitude to Mesele Economy for helping me produce this video. And if you like it, just subscribe or share the content with a friend. Season's greetings.